we want to open this up for questions as soon as possible. I love the Twitters. One of my favorite was a Twitter of one more session and we're off, not bothering about predicting blogs in 20 years. Caffeine bomb. Anyway, so those of you who want to wait and hear what the last session is, thank you. We have really heard from people who are really at the coalface. I think that you have not heard utopian fantasies about social networking, and you haven't heard dystopian views as well. You've heard really quite pragmatic and realistic, informed views from people who are actually doing things in a variety of arenas. If I could summarize, I think if I had to title what I've been hearing today, it would be, I think I'm stealing more from Richard than anyone else, is unrealized potential, in the sense that people seem to think that there's huge potential, but in many respects, not necessarily there. Openness and transparency could be greatly strengthened, but then again, we hear that posting PDFs and so forth, it's not quite there. Potential for much more democratic control, but also some worries about concentration. Some concern over platform competition and the degree to which there is competition in platforms versus control over content. And uncertainty, that was another theme. That we really don't have a lot of futurologists here. You heard a lot of guarded views about not just the future, but exactly what's going on now. So you have a lot of very problematic statements about exactly the impact on political campaigns or in business. And it clearly, no determinism. It's not that the social networking per se will have a particular impact. It's how it's implemented by particular people in particular circumstances and so forth. So I thought we're going to open up for questions. I want to surface one question, because I noticed that very few people mention public policy. I mean, I think there came up indirectly in a few cases, but I think that policy is one arena where there could be things on the horizon that would change the game in a major way. Well, that is, in terms of thinking about the future, there could be policy changes, there could be differences in business models, there could be technical developments. I'm wondering if the panelists if any of the panelists see potential game changers on the horizon, or what are they worried about in terms of either regulation or public policy, or is it economic financial models that may or fail or succeed? Is it new technological development? Not that we know the future, but what are the big variables in the environment that could actually change the potential of social networking for the better or worse? I don't know if anyone wants to pick that up, and if yes, Carrie?
Well, there's always the potential the government will do something stupid, which is pretty much certain, 100% certain. I think the thing that you have to think about is people's willingness to change. I think that's really the biggest part of it. And as I said in the previous panel, the one thing I can predict is most of us will be dead in 40 years, 20 to 40 years. And what this is about is not about us and not about people who are over 20 years old, really. It's about young people and how they embrace this, they use it. It's part of their lives, just the way television was part of my life growing up, the way telephones were part of my mother's life. It's inevitable. It's the arguments that go on about this that I've heard today, some of them, it's sort of like saying, you're being in the horse here, the car comes and saying, well, these horses are pretty good. I mean, why do we have to have cars? I mean, it's what the oxygen is going to be. And I think it's not a question of whether you like it or you're concerned. There are concerns about it and issues, but it's not. This is going to be the oxygen going forward. The interactive social internet space is how TV is going to get delivered, how movies, how music. That's just in the entertainment area. It's how politicians are going to communicate, and you've got to. You don't have to embrace it. You can ignore it, but you cannot. It's the way things are going to be. And increasingly as you go forward in every single aspect of society. And so you have to be thinking about the bigger issues such as privacy, such as the ability for universal access, the ability for these devices to be in the hands of a lot more people and at cheaper prices. Those are the kind of things we should be thinking about versus, worrying or belly aching about whether it's coming, because it's here. And what I always say whenever I get in some of these forums, and it's not a question of age, but in people that don't like it necessarily or have a big concern about it, is the kids love it.
Yeah.
And they do, and that's just the way it is. I mean, I joke the kids love it, so maybe you should try it, but it's something we should think about all the time.
So I just push you on that because
Sure.
it may well be that this is the problem. As the internet and social networking becomes more central to everything we do, to news, to government services, thereby it becomes much more of a focus of governmental regulation, control.
Well, they always try. I mean, they tried with the early internet with the child pornography legislation that already existed. There was already really good protections in child pornography, but because congressmen love nothing better to get their big ugly faces in front of cameras, they say child porn, and they know like a million cameras are going to. So, I mean, I think the issues are, first, that these companies have to self-regulate in terms of that's what they prefer to do. And second, the government is watching to make sure that there's correct protections in place, because these things are very easy to hack. They're very easy to manipulate. They're very easy to create fraud. But it's fraud that existed in old areas with credit cards or whatever came before it. So it's just to keep the vigilance up, because it creates, so much information about you. And it's, it's a good thing because you have access, and it's a bad thing because people have much more ability to have lots of information about you.
Well, I mean, I think, Kara, I agree with most of the points you make, but you're also taking a very Western perspective from it.
Right.
I think one of the big concerns that I have, at least from a policy perspective, is things like, what if China decides to break TCP/IP? Right, or like build its own encryption protocols so that the Wi-Fi routers that it's going to be building for its people all of a sudden are going to be starting to enforce in code a very different sort of view of the internet than the one that the one that it started with in the 60s and 70s around openness and transparency and so on. And I think what may end up happening here, and my fear is, right, that it is something that will become fragmented, and you'll have, we already have to a certain extent many different internets today because of language barriers and so on, but it would to me at least seem really terrible if that also then lost the kinds of network scale that we have and the ability for people to communicate effectively with each other, number one, and number two, not just the questions around fraud and privacy, which I think are very important, but also around censorship and filtering and tracking of people, which maybe because we're Americans, we take a bit more for granted.
Well, hello, the Chinese problem already exists. I mean, China's appalling in the way it treats its citizens related to the internet, and I don't think eventually they're going to have control over the situation. I think they do so at their peril. Because this thing is way too big for even a government. But the fact of the matter is they're already doing that.
Yeah, and I think that's a terribly optimistic view, right? Because most Chinese are perfectly happy. I mean, I shouldn't say that. I haven't surveyed most Chinese. But when I talk to people like Rebecca McKinnon and so on who live in the area, they talk about the Chinese who are actually using their internet, right? They're very happy, and they find it incredibly useful for them.
Well, you're talking about the Chinese becoming more oppressive, which I think if they get more oppressive, they're already appalling the way they're putting people in jail. I mean, it's and the fact that U.S. companies cooperate with them anyway is just insane. But I think that I'm talking about more oppression. I don't think that that's the way it's going. I don't think China's going to get a hold of this thing and be able to control it in the way they hope to. I think they're going to have a level of control over it that they're able to have, and then after a while, but they're certainly not going to control the rest of the world.
Well, or will other governments, behave the same way that Burma has behaved, for example?
Yeah, Burma's always been a mess.
Yeah, but again, it's like, so you look at, or even where, what was it, Evgeny, who talked earlier about, the 50 cent publishing. Right, where essentially it's government-sponsored disinformation and misinformation from hundreds of thousands of people who are paid to write, and it's a distributed way.
Incredibly, the government has never put out misinformation in our country. Pretty much, they do it every day.
No, but
weren't they poisoning people a couple of years back? I don't know. I just don't think that it's going. I think it's going the other way. As a technologist, as a builder, I tend to agree with you, but it is one of my greatest fears.
So government policy is potential shifts, et cetera. But yes, Richard, when you pick up.
Just answer your question, is there increasing pressure to regulate? I think, yes, as properties become bigger, that's kind of almost an inevitable rule. I remember the discussion we had a couple of years ago. The European Union has, in its wisdom, brought in some regulations to govern what you can do with audio-visual content on the internet, which is an extension of broadcasting rules into the internet space. And when you kind of talked about the rationale for that, people started by saying broadcasting regulation is governed by the fact we have bandwidth scarcity. And you said, well, on the internet, we don't have bandwidth scarcity, so why do you want to regulate audiovisual content then? And the answer came back to say that there is a unique power to audiovisual content. And what they meant was, particularly with something big, once you start reaching to a mass audience, once you reach a mass audience with audiovisual, it has effectively political and cultural power. And so therefore, anything on the internet that gets to the scale where it's regarded as having TV-like political and cultural power will attract the attention of the regulators. Now, where do I think that attention will focus? I think it'll focus particularly around issues of identity, because one of the major shifts that's taking place that is where traditionally internet was about the web property. If you had a blog, the identity was about the property. If you had a blog, your identity is tied up in that blog. What we're increasingly seeing is that people want persistent identity they take around with them. So the whole, sharing, twittering, all of this, your Twitter identity, everyone's twittering away here, is kind of really crucial to you, and you're dropping it into all sorts of places around the net, and you'll want to hang on to that. So I think that'll actually be one of the crunch areas as to whether or not what's happening now, which is that people like Facebook and Twitter and others are allowing people to develop these web identities, whether we're allowed to get on and do that in conversation with our customers, or whether governments want to intervene. And typically, again, identity and the regulation of identity and identity cards and all of this kind of stuff is an area where governments like to intervene. So we've got sort of two things sort of coming together that I think will encourage, and this will keep people like me in a job, will encourage governments to want to kind of come and talk to technology companies. It's this increasing power of audience and the fact we're going into areas that are very, very sensitive to them, like identity.
Are you getting more calls now that it's Facebook 300 million? 300 all of a sudden? Or?
Yeah, so I'll just give you an example. A conversation I had the other day, it was with a politician here in the UK, and we said, our daily reach in the UK now is 9 million people, half an hour a day. That's TV channel reach. When I said that to him, his eyes lit up. He said, Gordon Brown conference, live streaming, for whatever it's worth, let's kind of go and have a look at it. He was saying that because he was a campaigner, but I could imagine somebody on the more regulatory side, eyes lighting up, 9 million, half an hour every day. Crikey, we'd better try and tell you what you should display within that space.
Well, could you actually stop Sarah Palin from posting idiotic stuff on Facebook? I would like that regulation.
That's the kind of regulation. The special, just a one line.
Right.
Yeah.
Just one line of code. She'll think she's typing away like a lunatic up in Alaska.
All right. We'll see.
Okay, good.
But identity regulation is a great example of where you have really major cultural and cross-national differences in exactly what is permitted in terms of, I think in the US, they probably would not allow identification. You would want to have anonymity protected. Mm-hmm. In Britain, perhaps not.
Not so much with Facebook.
Yeah.
It's much more of a namespace.
It is. And so, we have an issue at the moment. In Germany, there is a law which says you must allow pseudonymous or anonymous identity in your property. And if you have a property that's based on a culture of real names, you've kind of got an immediate clash. You've got countries where ID cards are fine, and you can imagine somebody coming along and saying, okay, so we now want you to use your ID card before you register on any of these powerful sites. That might be something that someone will come up with at some point, and we're going to have to have that discussion with them.
So this is Dave's vision of a fragmented, nationalized web, instead of a worldwide web. But yes, Nigel.
Yeah, no, I think it's an arms race all the time between the technology unleashing opportunity and people rushing to either foreclose on valuable information or to make it more available. And I think we've heard some really good comments today, statements about, if governments have got public data, then they should make it public. The duty to publish should just be the given. Great principle. On the other hand, I was delighted to hear Facebook promoting fundamental data portability, because actually the social network sites whose IP really does reside in those exquisite address books should be prepared to pull down those walls. And I was interested to note that Brad Fitzpatrick at Google is now data liberator, dataliberation.org, I think is, and that actually the people who have gathered large amounts of information about people, about their networks, are realizing that they're not going to be able to hold on to it because there will be a demand, and the very same forces that led to the creation will demand a degree of transparency. Now, that That's important. The other side of this, in being the futurology piece, what can you predict? Well, you can certainly predict that space and place will get more and more exquisitely defined. And more of our digital breadcrumbs will mean that the triangulation, despite the encryption you want to put in and the pseudo-anonymization you want to put in, you will be deeply revealed by your digital behavior. And the challenge, of course, is one of privacy, and it's a well-traveled and furrowed path. But I think the issue about what we do as a culture to deal with social norms, whether there's regulation required to manage that process, just the notion that the instinct of a company is to say, well, I'm just going to give you better products, better quality. All my recommender systems will be better for knowing more about you. Well, then let me opt in. Just make that a fundamental principle of all my engagements. Or I would like some kind of confidence when that company goes out of business, I know what its duty of care is on the information, or that I can actually see transparently just what that agreement I've just clicked off has meant in terms of handing over my information to their interested third parties. Whenever you do those traces through and make it transparent, you reveal both the power, the reach, and the kind of less, perhaps, desirable aspects of continuous tracking. In this country, as we all know, we have it down to a T. And we have just a fantastically exquisite way of building databases, often held by government. And so one of the key things for me is that we ask very hard questions of the people who collect that data. If they're collecting it under statute or some obligation, the thing's right, that they should bloody well make sure it's correct. There should be a register, there should be independent audits. There's a whole range where the information, once given up, it's just really not taken seriously. And I think it's hugely important that people, organizations, and governments are held accountable. It's not that the privacy is dead. If your data's out there, you make people accountable for misuse.